Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Lovely to see everybody again. I love it how we all start waving to each other. That's the global wave that we can be introducing. Yeah, exactly. So, good day, everyone, and a blessed Maundy Thursday to all as we now start officially our Easter Triduum. For our friends in Asia, who may already have been to Mass, we pray that this may be a continuation and deepening of your prayers earlier today. So today in our session, we will first go to Getshemane with Nizar, and then Father David will reflect with us on Jesus's prayer in Getshemane. And before I hand over to our presenters today, allow me just to share a little bit about them. Nizar Haloon is a Christian Palestinian, a citizen of the State of Israel. He was born and raised in Jerusalem. However, he is deeply rooted in Galilee, where all of his extended family lives. He holds a BA in French linguistics and literature from the Hebrew University and has a master's degree in comparative literature from the Sorbonne University based in Paris. Today, he works as a journalist specializing in Christian Palestinian affairs and is a licensed tour guide. Father David Neuhaus was born into a Jewish family in South Africa, which immigrated to Israel when he was a teenager. Today, he is a Jesuit priest. He holds a master's and doctorate degrees in political science from the Hebrew University and has a pontifical license from the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. As a professor, he teaches at the Ratisbon Seminary, the Bethlehem University, as well as the Seminary of the Latin Catholic Patriarchate. Previously, Father David was the patriarchal vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics for a total of 8 years, and the coordinator of the pastoral care for immigrant workers and asylum seekers in Israel. As a reminder and conform to our other sessions this week, please raise all your questions in the chat window, and we will have a pause after each of the presenters to respond to all or at least some of the questions that you are raising. And with that, over to you, Nizar.
Thank you very much, Petra. Blessed week to everyone. We're going to jump right into it with the presentation, and then we'll have two parts, the presentation itself, and of course a video later on where we'll be walking through the Getshemane and in the church itself. So I'll start by sharing the screen here and opening my presentation. Up. All right. So Getshemane, the Basilica of the Agony. We're going to start by reading the passage in relation to the location itself. So I'm reading from Matthew 26:36. Jesus prays in Getshemane. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Getshemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, "Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." The betrayal and arrest of Jesus. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I shall kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Hail, Master." He kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, why are you here?" Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so?" At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, Have you come out against as a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat at the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted them and fled. So this is the context in which we'll be visiting the Garden of Getshemane and the Basilica of Getshemane. It's extremely important. All the details that we'll see in this passage will be found all over the church. So we'll find hints here and there that kind of re-put these words together and put them alive again. So if we move to the following slide, I want to give a larger location, larger context to where the Basilica is located. Okay, so we start with the first picture. You see the little point that we see on the map here. This is Getshemane. If you follow my mouse, the cursor here, this is the old city. We're going to get closer later on. Just want to show you that the Jordan River is behind, and the Dead Sea, and you can see it's really on the separation line between two geographical locations, right? So we know that Jericho is the lowest place on earth, and this is Jericho. Here, the greenish spot, it's an oasis. And before going to Jerusalem, Jesus will go from Jericho up to Jerusalem from this area. So this is the Judean desert. You have the Dead Sea and the Jordan River, and Getshemane is right here, and of course Jerusalem and the hills on this side. So if we get closer, we have Getshemane again closer. We still see the Judean desert, and this is the old city, the 1 square kilometer of the old city. And here we are. So this area here is still not clear. We'll get there soon. But we have here 12 domes of the church, the Basilica of Getshemane, the Basilica of the Agony, with its garden, right? You have all the olive trees right here. We'll be entering from this side, if you follow my mouse, right? And then entering to the Basilica itself. So you have the Basilica here. We move closer, we see Mount of Olives, right? This section here is the Mount of Olives. The Basilica is here again. We have the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, the sacred sanctuary for the Muslims, with the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, right? So back then, this used to be the Temple Mount, because Jesus mentions in the passages that he used to go there every day and pray and teach. We have the Kidron Valley that is separating the two areas. This Getshemane, Kidron Valley that continues down there. And for those who already visited the Holy Land, they also know that the city of David is not far away from here as well. right? So it's in this area that led to the temple with the steps that led into the temple. So most probably Jesus also took those steps to go into the temple back then. So Gethsemane, Mount of Olives. We have Temple Mount here because we're talking about the first century. And then we have the Holy Sepulchre, which is also very important for us tomorrow, for those who will be attending tomorrow's conference as well. So this is the Holy Sepulchre. But we have to mention another place that is not really pointed here on this map, which is the Caiaphas's house, right? He'll be arrested in Gethsemane and taken to Caiaphas's house to be judged. And Caiaphas's house is right here. So we have 4 important locations: Gethsemane, Temple Mount, Holy Sepulchre, and Caiaphas's house, which is on Mount Zion. Okay. So the location, we are on the eastern side of the Kidron Valley that we already mentioned, on the lower eastern foothills of Mount of Olives, to be precise, facing the old city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount where Jesus went to pray and teach. And in each place that we go in the Holy Land, when let's hopefully soon that the borders will be open, we'll be able to welcome pilgrims again. Wherever you go, it's important to point out that the important places are in important locations. Like if we visit like the important site of Megiddo or any other site, they are located on important junctions. So here we're talking about Jerusalem and the desert that we already mentioned before. The name Getsemane, which means Getshemane in Aramaic, and it comes to us through Greek and Latin, which literally means press oil, which basically is oil press, right? That used to be found there, and we know from Mount of Olives, well, all the olive trees, that this place was used for that as well. So we're taking a step back to see Gethsemane from far away. So the Kidron Valley is this area here, just below the facade, below the basilica, with all the olive trees. There have been recent excavations here by the Franciscans, and you have a small tunnel here that is being dug. That has been dug actually already. It's quite almost ready now for the past couple of years, that will link the basilica to the Kidron Valley to welcome more pilgrims, because on a high season day, you don't have enough space to welcome the pilgrims for masses, etc. So they're doing a tunnel to link the basilica with the Kidron Valley. That also part of it belongs to the Franciscans. And while digging there, they discovered a mikveh, which is a ritual, Jewish ritual bath, right in there, and they decided to move it, which is also a good sign because it shows that back then the place was already used. So history. We already talked about the New Testament, the first century period, and there's an important concept that we have to talk about, which is the tradition, right? When we talk about tradition, when you hear tradition, it usually feels that something that we do because we did last year. But in this context, when we are in the Holy Land and we talk about tradition, which comes from the word traditio in Latin, it means something that you inherit, right, from previous generations. So the Byzantines built all the sanctuaries in the Holy Land because of this concept of tradition, because the early Christians used to go and pray in these places and conserve the memory of this important place, right? We're talking about Gethsemane, we're talking about the Holy Sepulchre that we'll be talking about tomorrow. So when we link the first century period to the 4th century Byzantine period, the concept, the term tradition is extremely important, and you have to keep it with you all along, because that's how you will link those sites on the ground with the 1st century period. So Byzantine period, the basilica is built 4th century, and like most places as well, they will be destroyed in the 7th century by the Persians. Later on, the Crusaders get here in 1099, and they will start rebuilding some of the Byzantine places, not all of them. Like if we take the example of Tiberias, very few Byzantine places were built during the Crusader period. Why? We do not know why exactly. But this is, I mean, in Jerusalem, for instance, the Basilica of the Agony, it was rebuilt in the 12th century, and again destroyed in 1187 by the Muslim invasion and the loss of the first Crusader kingdom by the Crusaders. And later on in 1666, during the Ottoman period, the land will be purchased by the Franciscans. They will buy many lands during many lands where sites were located. And they will start building mainly in the beginning of the 20th century, like the case of the Basilica of the Agony in 1999 to 1919, sorry, and 1924. And here we have a name that you will find all over the Holy Land, a famous architect that worked mainly for the Franciscans, not only, but mainly, Antonio Barluzzi, that will build this magnificent church, truly remarkable edifice. Okay, so if you look at the left-hand side, you will see very interesting ground plan for the basilica. So here we have 3 basilicas in one plan, right? So if you look at a thick black line that you see here, this is the Byzantine period basilica, okay, and which has the Rock of the Agony that we will be seeing later on in the center. The Crusader period does not follow the Byzantine period structure, plan, but is slightly tilted, as you can see. The many things that the Crusader did in the Holy Land, we don't know why exactly. So we can see this this plan of being slightly tilted also elsewhere, and we do not know why exactly they did that. But it still included the Rock of the Agony in on the left-hand side of their basilica. And the modern basilica is the shaded one that we see here, and we see that it follows completely, almost completely. Some things are left outside the Byzantine period basilica. So we are at the entrance. So we talked about many things with the introduction, and we are at the entrance of the garden. And what we see on top here is the wall of the old city that we saw from the aerial picture of Google, right? We can see the golden dome of the Rock, which is interesting because we can see at the same time Getshemane and the area where Jesus went there, taught and prayed during his lifetime and when he was present in Jerusalem. So what we see at the entrance, we see, first of all, we are going to enter from the exit because that picture was taken during the Corona time. So they closed one of the gates, let only one gate open. So we see, first of all, the two gates where you enter from here usually, go to the church and then leave the church from here and continue maybe to other sanctuaries. The closest one nearby is the tomb of Mary, which is also a very interesting Crusader period and Byzantine period structure. So we have the gate here. Above the gate, we have the inscription Ortus Getsemane, which are 2 very interesting words because we're talking about ortus, which is in Latin an enclosed garden. And what does an enclosed garden remind us of? The Garden of Eden, right? That's very, very important. It's kind of a play, a back and forth between the place where Jesus went and agonized, basically, and then the place where we were thrown out of because of the original sin, and how Jesus will save us through also an enclosed garden and to go back to a garden that we were kind of thrown out of because of the original sin. So ortus is very interesting as well. So we find here and there old-time words that are really interconnected with each other, which are extremely important. Another important thing is the cross that we see above the inscription. The cross of Jerusalem that you see slightly here at the gate, of course above, and at the gates right here. For those of you who don't know, we have 2 explanations for this significance of the 5 crosses. So the cross of Jerusalem, we have the 5 wounds of Christ, of course, the 2 hands, the two feet, and the side of Jesus, the 5 wounds. Or there's another explanation. It could be both as well, which is the 5 ancient patriarchates of the Pentarchy, prior, of course, to the schism. We're talking about Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. So we have the 4 patriarchates, and Jerusalem in the center, which makes it the fifth. So two interesting explanations. So depends who you ask. Sometimes you get the two, sometimes you get one of them, and they're both valid answers. And the cross is used by many denominations, actually, not only Catholics, in the Holy Land. So you can see them on flags, you can see them on cars, you can see them on the doors of churches, etc. So we are in the church, in the garden, sorry, so in the sanctuary itself. And the first thing that you see are those beautiful ancient trees. Not all of them are ancient. Some of them were recently planted by visiting popes, like Pope Francis, most lately. And you can imagine, if you can close your eyes for a second and imagine how the place was before even building the basilica, and turn off the lights as well, right? Remember, I mean, try to imagine it with the being at night, Jesus being there with the disciples being nearby, when he took with him the three disciples, Peter and the sons of Zebedee, and it's quite impressive. So those trees, of course, when we're talking about an olive tree, it does not survive 800. I mean, all those 2,000 years, right? An olive tree can only survive 800 years. But what is interesting is that we know from agriculture, basically, that an olive tree that is cut can be reborn from its roots. And we know that also from this interesting quote from Isaiah 11:1, for instance. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, right? From his roots, a branch will bear fruit, which is also a connotation again. We talked about hortus, how it connects to other concepts. Here as well, we have the olive tree connecting again, right? Something how physical in front of us that connects to David, Jesus, and how something can get reborn and become even greater than what we expect. So this is the beautiful garden that we have here. So when you enter, that's what you'll see. We'll see that in the video later on. But the most ancient tree is the one that you see here on your left-hand side, which was dated by an Italian scientist team to go back to the Crusader period. But who knows? It could have been also during the lifetime of Jesus, and then it was reborn throughout the centuries into another tree, but from the same roots. So that's also a very interesting concept to keep in mind. So if we go back to the facade of the church, we can see the gable, right? The magnificent gable. We're not talking about a fresco here; it's mosaics, right? It's very impressive when you get there, when you are close to it, and when you take a step back. And we see here different parts of the gable, right? So we'll be dividing it into several parts, like the central one, the left one, and the right one, and then there's also the one up top. The church is called the Basilica of the Agony, the Basilica of Getshemane, or as well the Church of All Nations, because during the construction of the church, the Christian nations of the world donated money to help this construction, and those deers that we see here represent the Christian nations of the world looking up to the cross, which is quite impressive as well. So let's get closer to the gable and to the different parts of it. So this is the central one. We can see Jesus, right, with God the Father, who's holding the Alpha and the Omega, that is mentioned in the book of Revelations, right? The beginning, I am the beginning and the end. On the left-hand side, we have all the intellectuals, people of power, that were present in Jerusalem. We even have a harp here as well. That is also a reference to David. They're holding a sign that says ignoratio, ignorant, right? So when Jesus is coming down to Jerusalem, he talks about the catastrophe that is going to happen to Jerusalem, and they are ignorant of what's going to happen later on. On the right-hand side, we have the women of Jerusalem praying and lamenting the death of Jesus. We have Mary dressed in black and holding a dead baby Jesus, of course. And this is a prefiguration of what's going to happen. You can see that in many icons that were written. In the Oriental Church as well, you can see even Mary in one of the Oriental icons that she has just given birth to Jesus, but she is sad. And we already know this is a prefiguration of what's going to happen, because I mean it's her son, and she's extremely sad of what's about to happen to him. So taking again a step back, we see this sculpture The church itself is built in a neoclassical style, quite impressive. So Barluzzi, in all of his structures, and mainly here in this magnificent church, combines the modern with the ancient history, with the Gospels as well. So it's a very much intertwined and very smartly built, right? So a neoclassical style, beautiful capitals. We have the gable that we just talked about. We have the four evangelists, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And here's a closer look at them. And it's quite impressive that when you get to this church, the atmosphere outside and inside are quite different. Although when you go into this entrance that we just saw with the trees, it prepares you. Of course, when you are in a pilgrimage with a group, there's lots of chaos, right? Noise all over, and it's quite chaotic. But we have to remember all the time when we're going to such places to get the hints of what's about to happen, right? We're going to the garden, and slowly you'll see when we enter the church how dramatic the shift in the atmosphere is. Okay. So the inscriptions, have a look on the inscriptions real quick because they're really important. We have the first inscription that is located just below the gable. You can see it right here, right? In Latin, that says "Prece supplicanosque cum clamori valido et lacrimis offerens exauditus et pro sua reverencia," right? From Hebrews 5:7, which means he offered prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears, and he was heard because of his reverence. That is quite impressive. That's what we have with the prayers of Jesus as well. And just above the entrance, because we're about to enter the church, we have the quote that we just read in the first slide: "Sustinete hic et vigilanti mecum," from Matthew 26:38, which means remain here and keep watch or awake with me. So there's a very important word here that we have, which is hic, here, translated here, because we are in the Holy Land, right? We talk about the fifth gospel all the time. This is when we talk about hic, it has the heaviest weight, right? Because it is here. You are visiting at the place where Jesus was, and it's extremely important wherever you go in the Holy Land, especially in a place like Getshemane, because it will be reincarnated in a way in the Holy Rock that we'll be visiting in a couple of seconds here. So we are inside. You see the shift between the light, the blue sky, and the bright light that we had outside, and the beautiful structure inside. Classical physical structure. We're talking about the nave, two aisles, and the three apses. But the first thing that you notice when you go in is the shift, right? The shift in the colors, the shift in the mood. There's a feel of cold, dark, but still peaceful place to come and rest and reflect, right, in the middle of the day, because we are in the middle of the day, and you can see the contrast between the outside and the inside. And what adds to it is the alabaster panels that are dyed violet. We're going to talk about later on, but you can already see the feeling. You can look at the ceiling, you can see the stars with the blue mosaics, and you can even spot some flags, because we already mentioned that it was built. The foreign nations gave money to build this church. So this complete shift in atmosphere, and that's the brilliance of Antonio Barluzzi in many of his constructions in the Holy Land. So we're gonna advance and see the three apses and their mosaics. So we have the three apses. In the central one, we have the agony of Jesus. We read the passage. We can see a step back picture of the mosaic. This is a closer one down here. Okay, you can see the olive trees. You can see the blue mosaics, which represents the night back then. Smaller trees, older trees, still like today, basically. And Jesus on the rock, praying again and again. On the left-hand side, we have the betrayal of Jesus. Just before the moment when Judah is kissing him, or has just kissed him. It's a very interesting moment that they chose to depict there. And on the right-hand side, we have Jesus being arrested, right? We can see one of the slaves being on the ground, being hit, and with the three disciples and the torches, and we have all the mood that is already set. We talked about the Byzantine period and the genius of Barluzzi in the construction of the church itself. So we can see the flooring of the church around the wooden frame that we see here, right? And in the frame below this glass, we have the Byzantine period mosaics, which is quite impressive. So when I tell you that Barluzzi chooses to combine the old with the new style, combine the words of the Gospels into something that is materializing in a modern basilica, it is quite impressive. And here we have kind of a proof of concept in a way of his genius that we have. So you see he's following, if they rebuilt the same pattern, and it's extremely interesting. So the Rock of the Agony. So this is located just below the mosaic where Jesus is depicted on the Rock of the Agony. This is the rock itself, and around it you have a metal framing that represents the crown of thorns. So you have different symbolism combined into that charges not a tiny place, but still a small place. So wherever you look, you'll find symbolism that will lead you to this direction of Jesus' agony. On both sides as well, you have the alabaster panels, right? Violet, which it's the color that the priests wear during Lent as well. So on Holy Thursday, which is a day like today, the Franciscans go there and have a celebration at night where the Custos is the head of the Franciscans in the Holy Land, who also puts flowers on the rock to represent also the agony of Christ, which has both meanings. The color is the agony, but still roses, because there's a very famous French poet that talks about les fleurs du mal, right? The evil, the flowers from the evil, right? So here we have this positive and agonizing feeling in the same time in the rose petals. And back then I used to work for the custody, so this picture is taken from among the friars as well. So it's a very interesting perspective to see how things go. And the church, of course, is packed, and you have the live streaming and etc. that will happen also tonight. And from there, the Franciscans usually take it, not the Franciscans, but the local parish assembles outside. This is at night. They go out from the gate that is usually closed and head to the other station after Jesus being arrested, to the house of Caiaphas, through the valley that we talked about before. We would like to play the video now, if possible. Cute. So here, this is the pictures that we saw in the beginning. Hortus Getshemane with the cross. We're entering from the exit. We're very close to a main street, so you'll be hearing cars, but you hear also the sound of the birds. This is the beautiful garden. And during the Corona time, of course, unfortunately, it was extremely calm. But in a way, it's also very impressive to see it like this. You see very old trees, extremely thick. And this is how you'd continue if you'd be on a pilgrimage now. Many people just before Easter, or during Lenten time, they come here and you can actually book a small room in the gardens behind the basilica, where you can go for a couple of days to meditate, to pray. And it's quite impressive to me among those olive trees and be able to have access to the basilica all the time. On the left-hand side already, you can spot the basilica, the facade of the basilica. So you can see the garden is quite big. And sometimes even if you're there and there's a gardener inside, you can ask them to give you a small branch on the condition that there aren't many people around you, because everybody will start asking to have one as well. But I've seen it happen. So we're getting closer to the basilica. On the left-hand side is the old city of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount. And this is a different angle on the gable, on the facade. And the tree I talked about, one of the oldest trees, is right here. So here's another look to the direction of the old city. And we're going down the stairs to have a look at the facade again. So you can spot the two inscriptions, one here and one right here that we just mentioned. This is the entrance. That again represents olive trees. And you can already see how the mood changes. On that day, there was no one inside. You can see the alabaster panels. You never see the basilica this empty. So we're very lucky to have this footage, because usually it's packed with people and it's quite noisy. I mean, they try to keep things down, but still. And we're getting closer to the Rock of the Agony. The lights were turned off, but we can see the silhouette of the rock. And we can see Jesus there on the mosaic and the two side panels as well. This is the betrayal of Judas. Here we don't see much because of the lack of light, but this is the mosaic I showed you with the flooring of the church and the Byzantine period mosaics that were preserved. And replicated to the modern church. And this is the third one that we talked about just beside the org with Jesus being arrested. And here we go back to the Rock of the Agony.
Thank you, Nizar. So just a couple of questions before we go to Father David. Let's start off with the rock where we ended. The rock, it's surrounded by a crown of thorns, but what about the birds or the eagles on the four corners? What do they mean?
I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I have to check that and come back to you. But they might have to do something with the Holy Spirit, but I'm not quite sure 100%. So I'll get back to you on that.
Okay. Who owns the gardens?
The Franciscans. Yeah, the Franciscans. Remember in the beginning I talked about the garden, the basilica, and there's another garden that extends to the south of the area. Plus, a part of the Kidron Valley is also belongs to the custody. Remember, I talked about them digging a tunnel to link the basilica with this area. This also belongs to the custody, to the Franciscans.
Okay. Would much of the garden have been cut down for the building of these various basilicas?
The what? Sorry.
Would much of the garden, so all those trees, would they have been cut down to build the basilica?
The basilica, the area of the basilica was already used during the Byzantine period. So there were the trees were already cut in that area back then. So they didn't cut much, I would imagine.
And who prays in the basilica? Or for example, do the Orthodox Christians also pray there?
I've seen Orthodox Christians also pray there, yes.
And then going into the gardens, who was the artist of the facade mosaics?
His name is Pietro, I forgot his name. Pietro the something. I forgot his name.
Well, we can post that on the website.
Here we go. Pietro Arciardi, something like that. Pietro d'Arciardi. I can put the name on the chat if you want to check him out.
Great, thank you.
Yes, pleasure.
And then there was a question about the figures. What are the two figures in the center of the gable mosaic? Is that Jesus kneeling with God the Father?
Exactly. Yes, and God the Father holding the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning of the end, mentioned in the in John's Revelation. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And the meaning of the HIIC? Was that
HIIC?
Yeah. Somebody's asking that question.
I haven't seen that. Where did you see that?
Oh, we'll get back to that one, I think.
Okay.
And we'll just put it on again on the web. Then there were some questions about the rock. Would the betrayal have been at the rock?
At the rock?
Yes.
It had to be nearby, not at the rock itself, but nearby, because I mean, we'd imagine because he was praying, going back and forth. And when he went to the disciples and he told them that the hour has come, or Judas was already coming. So he was by the disciples, and then Judas was coming, and he had to be close by, but not at the rock itself.
And then there's also a question. There was also a rock under the mosaic of Jesus and Judas. Any significance of this rock?
It's the same one, I think, in the mosaic itself. I have to look back at it, but no, it has to be the same rock.
Okay, I think that was it. That was it for the questions at this stage. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Maybe that is a good
Okay,
segment.
I'm looking at the mosaic now. It's not the same rock, just a rock that was there. Because you can see the difference between the central mosaic and the rocks that are on both sides. It's not the same rock, just a topographical rock that was in the area, I would imagine. Just like something to represent in the mosaic itself. It's not geographically, that accurate. It's a depiction of the scene.
No, super. Thanks, Nizar.
Pleasure.
Thanks for that beautiful introduction of Getshemane. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Father David, who's actually going to be doing the reflection. And just while Father David is pulling that up, for those that were here on Sunday, you may remember Hannah pointed out a gentleman in the procession with the Mount of Olives, and this is the man, Father David, that Hannah had actually gone and pointed out.
So good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you, and thank you very much, Nizar. It was very moving, actually, to go to those places and hear about them. And I, for one, will be going there tonight with more knowledge than I had last year when I went there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Father.
I am going to share with you a PowerPoint, if I can get it to work. And I hope that you see what I see. So we're going to be focusing in on the prayer in Gethsemane. And as I wrote in the introduction to this short reflection, I'm going to read it again. The challenge of Holy Week, and especially the Triduum, is to fully enter into these moments in the life of Jesus. I think that we are not called to be spectators watching him, but rather to participate in the dramatic action that is unfolding. And a central moment in that action is Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane. His prayer must become our own. I will be focusing in on the Markan text for two reasons. One, because it's the first text that was written according to historical critical analysis. And two, because, at least in the Catholic Church and perhaps in other communions as well, we are in the year of Saint Mark. So I'd like to begin by really focusing in on the words of the prayer before I put it even into context. And these are the words, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet, not what I want, but what you want. Very, very powerful words. Jesus' desire for life. Remove this cup from me. And yet, even stronger than that, the words that express his total submission to the will of God. Now, I'm sure that not everyone, most of you perhaps, but not everyone can read the Greek. I didn't put it there to show off, but simply to try to express the broken syntax that is not communicated in the New Revised Standard Version. It's not really written, not what I want, but what you want. In Greek, uti ego thelo alla tisou, not what I want, but what you. And there is something powerful, dramatic. Jesus is in great despair. And in order to fully understand this despair, let's read through at least a part of the scene in Gethsemane around Jesus' prayer. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. Gregorete, keep awake. And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you. He came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake, Gregoresai, 1 hour? Keep awake, Gregorete, and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Now, of course, in order to understand the power of this text, we need to go back and read over the whole of the Gospel of Mark, because in a certain sense, we have reached a peak here. A peak in the narrative of the Gospel of Mark. We have moved from the first chapter, in which Jesus is presented as omnipotent. Let us look at those words, we surely remember them, where Jesus in the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark meets a leper. And the leper says to him, if you want, fellow, you can make me clean. And Jesus says, I do want, fellow, be made clean. This encounter with the leper comes after a day of incredible power. We all remember at the beginning of Mark, Jesus walks along the lake and calls 2 brothers and then another 2 brothers. And as he looks at them and calls them, they follow him. And we realize that this man has incredible power. And then on the Sabbath, he goes into the synagogue of Capernaum, and there is a man possessed, and he drives out the demon. And people are amazed and say, this man has such authority. And then he goes out of the synagogue and goes into the home of Simon Peter and raises Simon Peter's mother-in-law, who has a high fever. And that evening, as the Sabbath goes out, many, many come and bring all of their sick and possessed. And Jesus is just an icon of omnipotence. And then shortly afterwards, this is made clear. If you want, you can. And we know already from the narrative that indeed he can. And he says, I do want. And he does. But of course, this is not the story that Mark wants to tell. Yes, right from the first verse of the Gospel of Mark, Mark has told us that this Jesus is the Christ and the Son of God. But the Christ and the Son of God is going to show that he is emptying himself, ever more emptying himself of the power. Let us go back a moment just to glance over the text again. They come to a place called Getshemane. He takes with him those three, Peter, James, and John. Let's not forget them. And he tells them, keep awake. Jesus, distressed and agitated, pleads with them to stay awake. And then he prays his prayer, which ends with that resounding and so full of distress, not what I want, but what you. And he goes back to the disciples and finds them asleep. Keep awake, Jesus pleads. And remember again, we are not watching a theater. We are with, in a very profound and deep way on this Holy Thursday, we are with Jesus. We are with the disciples. Again, I repeat, the move in the Gospel of Mark is from a manifestation of great power that Jesus can, if he wants, to an emptying that is so magnificently theologized in the hymn that probably Paul composed, if he didn't inherit it from the ancient church, from the Epistle to the Philippians. Let the same mind be in you. We are not spectators. We are entering into the mystery. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself. Kenosis. He emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Paul, before Mark writes his narrative, has written this hymn, or, I repeat, has inherited it from the early church. The emptying, not what I will, not what I want, but what you, Father, want. And again, that emptying is the narrative drama of the Gospel of Mark. He empties himself more and more, humbling himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Again, I want to go back just a moment without showing you the text. It would be very worthwhile, we don't have time now to do that, but to read synoptically the three descriptions from the three synoptic Gospels of Jesus in Gethsemane. And if the critical historical exegetes are correct, and Mark is indeed the first to write this narrative, Matthew inheriting a huge part of the Gospel of Mark, And Luke, perhaps basing himself on both Mark and Matthew, it's very interesting to see how Matthew and Luke rewrite Gethsemane. There is no doubt that Mark is the most radical in portraying Jesus's distress, even in the syntax of the prayer. Matthew has a very faithful rendition of Mark, but changing a little because perhaps Matthew is scandalized, as we should be, by the Son of God being portrayed in such human terms in this moment of incredible distress. Distress and agitation. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is even more calm, almost like Socrates, facing death and being strengthened with an angel. But I go back to Mark because that is the Gospel of this year. And again, the icon is one of extreme distress and suffering. And I do believe that Mark here is meditating on this hymn from Philippians, the emptying, the humbling, the becoming obedient to the point of death. In fact, this is the vocation of Israel. Jesus, as we know, comes to fulfill the Old Testament. And the central character in the Old Testament is the Son of God, the people of Israel. And in Exodus 24, after Israel has received the first part of the Torah, there is an incredible scene that also conjures up Holy Thursday. And you'll see why when we come to the end of this marvelous text in Exodus 24, the covenant text. Then he said to Moses, this is God speaking, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship at a distance. Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. That's chapter 20, 21, 22, and 23. All the words, how they must live, the will of God for the people. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. I hope I'm not alone in hearing an echo here, a foreshadowing of Jesus's not what I will, but what you, not what I want, but you, to do the will of the Father. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 pillars corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed oxen as offerings of well-being to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he dashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Na'aseh v'nishma in Hebrew. We will do and we will, yes, be obedient, but we will be constantly listening to the voice of the Father. We are moving into sonship, from disobedience into sonship, daughtership, to be children of God. Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people, and the people are reborn in this blood, and said, see the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Abihu, and the 70 of the elders of Israel went up. Now look what it says. Something incredible and very rare. And they saw the God of Israel. They have listened, and now they see the God of Israel. Under his feet there was something like a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. God did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. Also, they beheld God, and they celebrated Mass. And they ate and drank. An astonishing text. You see the link with Holy Thursday? Not only the echo of not what I will, but what you, but also the eating and the drinking in the presence of God. The Son is born in listening and doing the will of God. Now, please remember that in this scene, Jesus is accompanied by 3. Peter, James, and John are taken into the depth of the garden to witness, and they fall asleep. Indeed, this is a very troubling element in the Gospel of Mark. The biggest obstacles on the road, the biggest obstacles on Jesus' way are the disciples. This is so contemporary as we discover the darkness that still exists in us and in our church. Mark indeed portrays Jesus' enemies, the leaders of the Jews, the Roman Empire, but nothing attains the depths of animosity of the disciples. Now it's interesting again to remember that Peter, James, and John are the first to witness the resurrection. The resurrection not described of Jesus nowhere in Mark's Gospel, of course in the additions that were added afterwards, but nowhere in what Mark wrote do we have an account of the resurrection. But we have the raising of the daughter of Jairus, the head of the synagogue, and Peter, James, and John accompany Jesus as he raises that little girl, that 12-year-old girl from the dead. And then another time we have the 3, and I want to read that account because somehow we need to keep this on our horizon as well as we go through these dark hours in Gethsemane. Let's read this text that comes at the epicenter of the Gospel of Mark, together with the proclamation of Peter. And Jesus calling Peter, Satan. We remember that account. And then, verse 34, probably the absolute center of the Gospel of Mark, if you want to be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. And then afterwards, these 3 are given a special gift, a gift of a vision of Jesus' glory so that they can accompany him and remain awake in the garden. Right at the center of the Gospel of Mark, together with Caesarea Philippi and taking up the cross and following Jesus, there is this text, 6 days later. Probably Mark meant the Sabbath. Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. This is the absolute opposite of Gethsemane. This is the glory. This is what we know as the transfiguration, a foretaste of the resurrection. Then Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi. I do not believe that word is rabbi, but rather Lord. And so writes Matthew and Luke, Lord, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Peter doesn't want to go down the mountain. Jesus has already said, when I go down the mountain, the Son of Man must suffer much. And Peter says, let's stay here. It is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Indeed, he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him. Listen to him in Gethsemane. Stay awake and listen to him. We already must be aware that that's what's being asked. Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. The Jesus they must follow down the mountain. The Jesus they must follow to Jerusalem. The Jesus who will tell them again and again, I am going to Jerusalem to suffer much. Can we be with him? Can we enter into discipleship? We know that means we will suffer with him. And this is the path along which he leads as we take up our cross and follow him. In the Gospel of Mark, there are 2 major discourses of Jesus. Yes, in Matthew there are 5, but in this earlier Gospel there are 2. There is the great discourse of the parables. Jesus tells the parables in Galilee. Those parables make the kingdom of heaven present, the kingdom of God in Mark's language. The kingdom of God, as we hear, so we see. This wonderful discipline that we must learn as we read the Bible and follow Jesus, to start to see with our ears, because our eyes lead us astray. That's a first discourse in chapter 4 of the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus reaches Jerusalem, he gives another great discourse, a great teaching, not about parables this time, but about eschatology, the end things, when we will see the kingdom of God. And right at the end of that very powerful teaching in chapter 13, this is what Jesus says to us in a very particular way on this Holy Thursday. Says to us all through the period of Lent. And of course, Lent is only preparation for life as disciples of Jesus in the world. He says, right at the end of chapter 13, beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey. When he leaves home, he puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore, keep awake, gregorete, for you do not know when the master of the house will come in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn. Or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake, gregorete. Jesus is already telling us that we indeed need to keep awake. Notice, and this will be a last little point, notice how he speaks to Simon. He came and found them sleeping, not awake. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Do you notice that? The one named the Rock has again become Simon, for he is asleep. Let us pray in a very special way on this Holy Thursday, as we remember the gift Jesus has given us, the gift of the Eucharist, the gift of his body and blood, that we must stay awake to be with him. We are not spectators who might fall asleep when the show gets boring. We are entering into the deepest mystery of this hour, for the hour has come, and we want to be with him.
Thank you very much, Father David. So there's a couple of questions coming through. And the first one is, if the disciples had fallen asleep, where does the prayer account of Christ come from?
So let me first affirm the question. The question is one that exegetes ask. In other words, if they were sleeping, how on earth did they hear what Jesus was saying? I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone can provide an answer for that question. But of course, I think that we need to realize that that is the type of question a journalist might ask. I don't think it needs to trouble us as we meditate on the Gospel of Mark, and we try to be those disciples who are awake and hear that perpetual prayer of Jesus, which needs to be our prayer. Not what I want, but what you, Father, what you want. For we want to be restored to that sonship, daughtership, that image and likeness of God, which means that we are attuned to the voice of God. Again, the foundational experience is the listening. And if we listen, we will see. So, Petra, I'm escaping the question because I don't have an answer. But again, I have found that question asked by serious exegetes. Okay, I'm not sure that the question would have much troubled Mark.
And then another question, what is the significance of Jesus taking the three disciples, so Peter, John, and James, both, with praying and going here at Getshemane, but then also in the Transfiguration? So in other words, why didn't he take all 12?
Yes.
And only those three?
So this is an interesting feature of the Markan Gospel, and it's, again, I'm not sure that I have the answer. I'm unfortunately just a Jesuit, and I have no divine inspiration or visions of Mark coming to explain to me. But what I do notice is that, and this is a special feature of the Gospel of Mark, that right from chapter 3, when the 12 are named for the first time, all the 12 are named for the first time in chapter 3, he sets these three aside by giving them different names. Simon, who is known as Peter, James and John, who are known as the sons of lightning, Boanerges. He then underlines their special closeness to Jesus when he takes them with him in going to the house of Jairus to raise the 12-year-old girl. Now, when we come to the central part of the Gospel of Mark, and those are chapters 8 to 10, we see in the center of these chapters the three taken up the mountain. But we also notice that these three are very particular obstacles on the way of Jesus. When Jesus in chapter 8 says that he, the Son of Man, must suffer much, Peter, who has just proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah, finally come to realize who Jesus really is, immediately becomes an obstacle and rebukes him for talking about suffering. And Jesus calls Peter, right at the center of the gospel, Satan, the one who has come to tempt him from his way, and says, "Get behind me." Now, what's interesting to note is to link that to what happens in chapter 10 at the end of this section, when, again, Jesus talks about his sufferings, and the two, James and John, come to ask whether they can sit on his left side and his right side in glory. Again, obstacles on Jesus's way. It's very interesting to note that when Matthew rewrites the story, he's going to blame that on a woman rather than let the two take responsibility for their words. And he's going to say their mother comes and asks if they can sit on his left side or right side. Mark has no scruples about presenting the disciples in a very dark light. And again, I think that this gospel is very prophetic for us in the crises that we are living through in the life of our church, and perhaps are facing our own reality as failed disciples over and over again. So again, it's very interesting that these three play a very particular role in the Gospel of Mark. Again, why is that? Well, I think that it adds to the dramatic impact of the story that Mark is telling, a story about Jesus that again is not a theater piece, but something inviting us into that intimate discipleship.
Another question, what does the Gospel of John contribute to the message of Getshemane?
Now, you all noticed, of course, and the person who asked this question is throwing it in my face, that I spoke only about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We know that John is very, very different, very different. And what is so fascinating about John is that, he does not have this distress and anguish in Gethsemane, although there is a very brief reference to Jesus's great distress and anguish in the Gospel of John in chapter 12. But what is very powerful in the Gospel of John is that John will see Jesus' suffering as his glory. I'll give an example. If you look, and I think it's in chapter 13, just as Judas leaves the Last Supper to go and betray Jesus, Jesus says, now comes the time of glorification. And 5 times in the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John, he talks about the Father being glorified, in the Son who is glorified, so that the Father can be glorified. The cross becomes a moment of glorification. And again, I think it goes hand in hand with Mark's understanding of Jesus really bringing to fulfillment that na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and constantly listen to the Father in order to do the Father's will. This is the Father's will. Of course, the huge question is why? Why is the Father's will this incredible suffering? A question both for Mark and for John. By the way, I'm convinced that there's a very close theological and even literary relationship between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John. And I know that many theologians over time have said, well, Jesus in his suffering is paying the price of sin. And I say, well, why the hell can't God forego the price of sin? And so I'm not convinced that that is how Mark and John understand what is going on. I think, again, it is we do not wake up until we see Jesus crucified. It is we who crucified Jesus and only wake up when he is hanging on the cross. It is when we gaze at Jesus hanging on the cross, or if you like, as we watch him being reduced to the suffering servant. The text that we will read tomorrow, the suffering servant, chapter 53 of Isaiah. It is only when we see the fruit of what we're capable of, the fruit of our sin, that we can in fact wake up and reach out our hand and say, help, so that Jesus can reach out his hand and pull us out of the storm waters of sin.
Thank you. Okay, so referring to, sorry, there's one question coming in here. Oh, no, there's more coming now. What are some of the contemporary lessons that the church can learn from the Garden of Gethsemane?
So again, I mean, what the church has always needed to learn from the Garden of Gethsemane is to make this prayer of Jesus our prayer. Not my will, but your will. And that is a church that has sometimes been tempted by its own power, by what it could inflict on society. So that is an eternal message. But I think what we need to really take in today in this description of Gethsemane, by focusing in on Jesus's plaintive plea, stay awake, is our own tendency to fall asleep and to become again a church that is more aware of our own weakness. Again, I'm very, very convinced that Paul is a very faithful disciple of, that Mark is a very faithful disciple of Paul, and he writes his narrative of Jesus focusing in on Paul. And so even that, if you remember in the, Jesus is saying to Peter, the flesh is weak. The flesh is weak. To go back and read how Paul describes the struggle between the flesh and the spirit in chapter 7 of the Romans. In our gazing upon a church and the light that is being shone on the church that shows some of the ugliest episodes that we are discovering, I think again we need to be humble. We need to realize that this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, who is the Christ and the Son of God. That beginning is leading us slowly in our own lives, in the life of the church, to a place where we will be transformed into Jesus's image and likeness. Then that will be the end of the gospel. The end, the telos of the gospel, is that we become like Jesus. But that is a road that passes through Gethsemane. Not my will, but your will be done.
You spoke about the obedience to the commandments in the Old Testament as a defining moment of sonship, but how would Jews understand Son of God?
Well, that's interesting, of course, because I think that because we Christians have kind of taken a monopoly on the Son of God, many Jews would say, well, that's something very pagan. But what is very interesting to realize is that in what we call the Old Testament, which is, of course, the part of Scripture that Jews and Christians share, there is a constant reference to God's desire to be father of a son. Again, sorry for the masculinist language, father-son. I don't have any problem with mother-daughter, but the language is father-son in the Hebrew. And the first time that becomes absolutely explicit is at the burning bush, where God says to Moses, go and say to Pharaoh to let my son go. And reflecting back from that very powerful, it's chapter 4, verses 21 and 22, reflecting back from that very powerful proclamation, very clear declaration of the fathership of God and the sonship of Israel, we can read back to Genesis and suddenly realize that the whole description of the creation of the human person is really the description of a parent-child relationship. What does it mean to be created in the image and likeness? I suddenly realized what that meant when I was walking down the street with my father. I have not lived in the same country as my father since I was 15 years old, and his friends don't know me. And walking down the street and meeting a friend, and the friend looking at me and then looking at my father and saying to my father, my God, that must be your son. He's your splitting image. And suddenly, wow, that's what it means to be in the image and likeness. Or a father in chapter 2 of Genesis who goes out to look for a wife for his son because he says it's not good for him to be alone. This language is very father-son language. Jews are scared of that language because of the way that Christians have monopolized the language. But I think that language is inherent to the relationship that is described between a parent and child all through the Old Testament.
I think that our time is basically up. But thank you for those questions as well. I don't know if there's any urgent or pressing other questions that somebody wants to still ask, but if so, just put it in the chat window. Yeah. But otherwise, I'm going to say, first of all, let me start by saying thank you to Father David for preparing our minds and spirits in such a moving and reflective manner, and for opening the door for us to deepen and to reflect and to listen more deeply on the meaning of Easter and on Jesus' prayer to his loving Father. Indeed, may Jesus' prayer become our prayer of openness and emptying, and that we then are able to also say, not what I want, but what you want. So this concludes our session for today. And please join us again tomorrow when we'll be going with our Tentua friends to Golgotha, or Calvary as it's also known. And as a reminder, we will be starting 3 hours later than today. So that's for the people in Europe, 7 o'clock CET. And with that, I'm just wishing you all a good continuation of Holy Thursday. And again, a big thank you to Nizar and Father David. And thank you very much.